Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 48, Jim Callaghan. All the right notes, not necessarily in the right order. Jim Callaghan, the Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979, has been cast as something of an in-between Prime Minister. He's one of those Prime Ministers who never actually won a general election, but he was popular in his own way. However, being popular isn't always a good thing for a Prime Minister. The two Prime Ministers before him, Harold Wilson and Edward Heath, dominated their previous decade. Margaret Thatcher, in the meantime, dominated the decade after. And none of them, or arguably, were as likeable as Jim Callaghan. Jim Callaghan filled the gap between those two eras, yet he's not one of the most famous of the post-war Prime Ministers, getting lost amidst those era-defining faces. So here, we'll look at the man who everyone liked, yet who unwittingly brought about the end of an era in British politics. He led to major changes, so perhaps in this way he was more important than his predecessors. Callaghan reached the top job relatively late in life, having achieved much in politics, as we'll see. Some politicians are brimming with potential before they actually reach the premiership, and are talked about in terms of a lost opportunity when they finally get the job. I don't think Jim Callaghan quite seems to fit into that category, because he did achieve a great deal in his career. As we'll see in this episode, he seemed to do a lot right. He managed the controversies of his premiership reasonably well, with exceptions, and he was a consensus seeker rather than a top-down leader like his successor. Somehow, however, as a Prime Minister, he's seen as something of a flop, someone who let Margaret Thatcher take over and change the whole political consensus. Anyone from the United Kingdom, particularly of a certain age, will know exactly what we're referring to in the subtitle of this episode. All the right notes, not necessarily in the right order. It's a reference to a famous comedy routine by popular UK comedians Morecambe and Wise. The quote from a famous sketch is from the early 1970s, so not quite the time when Callaghan was in office, but nevertheless it did seem to suit him, as a politician who got so much right, but somehow, despite playing many of the right notes, everything went wrong for him anyway. He's not viewed as one of history's most successful prime ministers. In fact, he's more famous for another quotation, from Shakespeare this time, "The winter of discontent." Now that phrase came from the play Richard III, and it's the term that came to define the end of Callaghan's premiership. We'll look at it here. Hand in hand with that phrase is another famous headline from the era, "Crisis? What crisis?" Another phrase used towards the end of Callaghan's premiership. What was Callaghan like? He was the last representative of the post-war consensus, and seemed to represent an old guard, but not the usual old guard of aristocrats and posh gentlemen. Jim Callaghan had entered politics through the unions, succeeding thanks to his centre-leaning version of Labour Party politics, a practical, old-fashioned Labour politician rather than an ideological socialist. One of his nicknames was Sunny Jim, and he seemed to have an authentic sense of being a man of the people, of someone who talked the same language as the people on the street. He seems to have been a diplomatic man who could listen to arguments and make his own decisions. He'd make you think he'd agreed with you when actually he totally disagreed, and then he would come up with his own choices. He was a very experienced politician when he became Prime Minister, and a word that we saw a few times in the biographies when we were reading about him was shrewd. What was the historical background? The 1960s were swinging and the 1970s were stinking. Looking back, it seems to have been a pessimistic era. Even Callaghan himself in 1974 stated that the UK was in decline. It just seemed self-evident at the time. And even now, when the economy looks like it's heading into recession, pundits will warn that the country could go back to the 1970s, as if it was some sort of bogeyman. The economic crisis of the decade was prompted in 1973 by a sudden hike in the price of oil, when oil-producing countries who were members of OPEC restricted the supply of their product. There were also fundamental changes in the international financial system, prompted by the United States' reaction to recession and its need to fund the Vietnam War. These factors combined to give the world a substantial economic shock. The UK was still recovering from these shocks by the time Callaghan came to power. Although the recession in the UK had ended by 1975, Callaghan had to go to the International Monetary Fund for cash to keep the country afloat. Despite all this doom and gloom, this was the first colour decade, a decade when package holidays took off, pun intended. There was something anachronistic going on in the UK in the late 70s. Culturally, snarling punk music was dominating, and it seemed to set the tone to a certain extent, although there was plenty of mainstream music in the charts as well. In the US, we could also talk about the rise of disco, in some ways its smoothness being the polar opposite of punk. Amidst all these cultural phenomenon, Jim Callaghan just seemed to be from a different world altogether. What was happening in the US at the time? It's curious that Callaghan's time in office is shadowed by similarly short-term presidents in the US. Despite the brevity of Callaghan's premiership, his time in office overlapped with two presidents. The first was Gerald Ford, who, like Callaghan, had inherited his premiership after his predecessor resigned, albeit for very different reasons. Jimmy Carter, in the meantime, entered into his tenure as president around 9 months into Callaghan's premiership. Who could vote? In each episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, we like to take a look at who could vote to show the progress of democracy over the years. Now, this is the 38th Prime Minister we've covered here on Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and it's also the 48th Prime Minister in chronological order. So patterns have emerged, particularly with regards to this section. Regular listeners, for example, will know that there have been no major changes in the voting system since 1928, when women were given the vote on equal terms with men. In 1969, there was a slight tweak when the voting age was lowered to 18, but when we look at all those legal changes, another pattern has emerged when we ask the question who could vote, and it is that the long list of prime ministers who were never actually chosen, directly at least, by the general public. So, arguably, no one got the opportunity to vote for them. There are arguments that the UK system is better for prioritising parties over personalities. Sometimes there were strong reasons for avoiding gaining a mandate directly from the people. See the episodes on Lloyd George and Churchill for pretty good reasons to avoid general elections. Sometimes it seems, rather frustratingly, that these prime ministers change on a whim, as has happened more than once in the last decade. Perhaps Callaghan's is one of the better reasons for being granted the role of PM as opposed to being voted PM, as we'll explain in the section on how Callaghan became Prime Minister. What was Callaghan's background? He was born on the 27th of March 1912 in Portsmouth on the southern coast of England. When he died on the 26th of March 2005, he became the longest-lived Prime Minister ever at 92 years and 364 days. He beat Harold Macmillan by just 42 days. Back to his childhood, however, and Callaghan's father died when he was 9, leaving his mother to bring him up on very limited income. His mother therefore benefited directly from the first Labour government, headed by Ramsay MacDonald in 1924. Callaghan went to secondary school in Portsmouth, but he went on to get a job after school in the tax office. It's worth noting also that his early adulthood must have influenced him, as these were the 1920s and 30s, years of depression. Callaghan was one of only 8 prime ministers of the current 57 who did not attend university. It's perhaps worth noting that more premiers went to Oxford University alone, 20, and Cambridge University, 14, than didn't go to university. In this sense, however, Callaghan does join some of the greatest of the UK's premiers, not least war leaders such as the aforementioned Churchill, Lloyd George, and one of the UK's most famous military figures, the Duke of Wellington. So he's in good company there. Similar to Lloyd George, Callaghan didn't go to university because he was working class. And in Callaghan's case, he was expected to go to work rather than university. Quite simply, there wasn't any money for such luxuries. Now this is completely unlike most other premiers who didn't go to university, who didn't go basically because they were so rich there didn't seem much point. So, instead of going on to further education, he worked in the tax office, where he also joined a union. Callaghan was also the last Prime Minister to take part in World War II, serving in the Navy. He became an MP in the 1945 general election, when Clem Attlee won against Winston Churchill, leading the Labour Party into power. It was almost 20 years later when Harold Wilson came into office, in 1964, and by this time Callaghan was 52 years old and had been an MP for almost 20 years. And it was Harold Wilson who gave Callaghan the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer. That put him on the front line during turbulent economic times, however, with international economic agreements made at the time of the Second World War straining against the realities of 1960s economies. Callaghan was moved into his second role of state, the Home Office, when the pound was devalued in 1967. How did Callaghan become Prime Minister? Harold Wilson was Prime Minister twice, and his second time as Premier began in 1974. At this time, he gave Callaghan the role of Foreign Secretary, and this gave Callaghan a memorable record. He's the only Prime Minister ever to have held all three of the most important offices of state as well as Prime Minister: Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary. It means that we could argue that he was one of the most experienced Prime Ministers ever by the time he got into the job. And it's this experience which meant that when Wilson resigned as Prime Minister in 1976 due to ill health, Callaghan beat stiff competition to become the new leader of the Labour Party and thus the new Prime Minister. Sometimes popular and experienced people do get the job. What were Callaghan's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? We've perhaps already given his most memorable achievement, the fact that he was in those 4 offices of state, and apart from that, his main achievement seems to have been just to hold this government together, and even to increase his popularity. He was forced to make difficult decisions such as going to the IMF for a loan, but he did seem to manage the subsequent tensions well. What led to Callaghan leaving the job of Prime Minister? He'd fought stiff internal battles to become Prime Minister, but his mandate hadn't been tested by the general public, which always puts a Premier in a relatively weak position. Furthermore, his predecessor, Harold Wilson, had won the previous general election, but he'd only had a majority of 3 seats, which had all disappeared in by-elections by the time Callaghan entered the job. This meant that he relied on the support of other parties, particularly the Liberal Party and the Scottish National Party, to get anything done. It did all seem a bit of a mess, and although Callaghan was personally popular throughout his premiership, such popularity wasn't necessarily what was wanted in a politician at that time. People, perhaps, wanted someone who could sort out the mess that the country seemed to be in. It seems to be generally agreed that Callaghan should have held a general election in 1978, when, despite economic difficulties, he'd come to expect that the unions would limit their pay demands, and he seemed to have a stable government despite relying on other parties. However, Callaghan held on over the following winter, the one that would come to be known as the Winter of Discontent, as unions began to strike for more pay. Everything seemed to be going out of control, and in the end it was that series of strikes, particularly over a cold winter, that weakened Callaghan's hand. He'd come from a union background, but it was the unions that ended him. Callaghan's premiership is famous for a headline in response to that series of strikes: "Crisis? What crisis?" He was trying to make out that these strikes weren't such a big deal, but things were looking out of control, and the Conservatives made the most of this situation. Something similar had happened to Herbert Asquith, who was a similarly lugubrious and well-liked man, who, however, was soon swept aside when World War I broke out. The time, it seems, had come for a more forceful Prime Minister, Lloyd George in the latter's case, and Margaret Thatcher in Callaghan's case. Thatcher exploited a similar sense that she would replace Callaghan's pleasant lugubriousness with a more vigorous style of premiership, and she won. It's been written that in the 1970s, in 1974 to be exact, Callaghan stated that the UK was in decline. He said that if he'd been a young man, he would emigrate, adding, with a patriotic twist, that he would then wake up and ask himself if there was any place he would actually prefer to go. Now, these comments weren't made a big deal of at the time, but this attitude was one that the Conservative Party grasped. Margaret Thatcher swept into office, in part, by dismissing such pessimism as nonsense and, in her own way, telling the nation to pull up its socks and start believing in itself again. It was a message that many were willing to hear, so Thatcher took hold of the narrative of the UK. There is a way in which, however, we could argue that Callaghan let her do this. He even seemed to predict it himself with one of his most famous quotations from the time of the 1979 election, being, "There are times, perhaps every 30 years, when there is a sea change in politics. I suspect that there is now such a sea change, and it is for Mrs. Thatcher." Now, perhaps we're overthinking things here, but this quotation doesn't seem to suggest a man who is fighting for his political life. As such, it perhaps reveals the best and the worst of Callaghan, a shrewd, experienced operator who could see that the tide was turning, but, rather than being stirred to fight that tide, seemed somehow to be resigned to the situation and let the tide wash over him. Now, I'm pretty sure more detailed research would find a much more complex story there, but perhaps it does contribute to why Callaghan isn't one of the more famous of the post-World War II Prime Ministers. Callaghan let in an era that went counter to much, if not everything, that he believed in. He seems to have been forgiven by the Labour Party for being the man in charge when they were pushed out of office for 18 years. He can't take all the blame, however, and seems to gain a pass by being well liked and clearly a sincere, experienced and intelligent politician. Ultimately, again, however, this is perhaps why he isn't one of the more famous prime ministers. His geniality meant that he was playing the right notes, but, stretching this metaphor to its absolute limits, the Conservatives were the one who were playing them in the right order at that particular time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. I hope you enjoyed that, and please do give it a like if you can before you move on. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and you want to hear more about British Prime Ministers. Above all, thank you for listening, everyone. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 48, Jim Callaghan. All the right notes, not necessarily in the right order. Goodbye.